Even to imagine that one of Apple's co-founders living in a small mobile home is hard to believe. Ronald even went on to say that if he had the choice to choose between Steve Jobs and Ice Cube, he would choose to hug Ice Cube for getting bombed. Months after signing contract with Byte Computers, Ronald resigned from Apple and sold back his entire 10% stake to two Steves for nearly... Hey guys, this is Prashant from Tech Pluto, and today we have a very special video, and that special video is about Apple's co-founder. Well, this co-founder is somebody you have not probably heard about. At least I did not know about this guy. The name of the guy is Ronald Wayne, the little-known Apple co-founder. When we think of Apple, we immediately think of company's two legendary founders, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. The story of how these two CEOs have founded Apple in a humble garage and eventually transformed this company into a $1 trillion one has become stuff of a legend. Wozniak was an engineering maverick and Jobs was a marketing genius whose creative abilities were second to none. It was a match made in heaven. There's no doubt that Wozniak and Jobs deserve every bit of credit for Apple's resounding success. But what most people are not aware is that Apple had another co-founder, a third one. But who is Ronald Wayne really, and how and when did he get associated with Apple, and what really prompted Wayne to resign from Apple? But the story of Apple's little-known founder started in Cleveland, Ohio, the place he was born in the year 1934. Well, Wayne had a very insignificant childhood. He was neither good in studies nor brilliant in sports, but like all great minds, Wayne had the curiosity and urge to learn new things. And it was thanks to this tenacity to learn new things that he embarked on a journey to self-education to learn electrical engineering and product development. This urge of self-education eventually helped him in landing several good jobs during his 20s and 30s. But in the year 1971, when Ronald was 37 years of age, he was bitten by the entrepreneurial bug and started his own business venture. Well, Ronald started a company called Cyan that was based out of Las Vegas and specialized in designing and manufacturing slot machines. Well, he worked on this company for nearly 5 years. But despite putting all his heart and sweat, Ronald's company proved to be a big failure, and he had to finally close that company. The collapse of this business brought huge financial hardship on Ronald. He had to pay back all the debt and outstanding loans to investors and banks, and it took several years before he could clear all his outstanding dues. Clearly, enduring the failure of his business proved to be way too traumatic for this young man. He promised himself that he will never ever dabble into business and avoid taking any big risks in his professional career. Well, Ronald said in a TV interview in 2014 that I discovered very quickly that I had no business being in business. I was far better working in engineering. Ronald's newfound dislike for business and his aversion to take risk was going to play a key role in the way his future was going to unfold. And this fact brings us to a very interesting phase in Ronald's life, a period when he met a 21-year-old young man called Steve Jobs. Well, Ronald Wayne met Steve Jobs and also Jobs' friend Steve Wozniak while working for a video game company called Atari. Well, Ronald worked as a chief draftsman at Atari Video Games, which was actually the first job that Ronald took up following up the collapse of his business. Now, despite Ronald's failure in tasting success in business, Jobs proposed an idea of starting a joint business of manufacturing slot machines. Well, Jobs said that he had access to nearly $50,000, which could help in making decent number of slot machines and selling them in a good profit in the market. But Ronald quickly rejected this proposal, arguing that he had already burnt his fingers in the slot machine business. Well, Ronald also rejected the business proposal because he was also not very fond of Jobs. This is not really surprising considering that most people who worked with Jobs never really liked his no-nonsense attitude and his snobbish behavior. Well, Ronald even went on to say that if he had the choice to choose between Steve Jobs and Ice Cube, he would choose to hug Ice Cube for getting bombed. At the same time, he recognized that Jobs was something special. He had the drive and passion that probably only few people have. And hence, when Jobs proposed another business venture to Ronald, he decided to take the plunge. Thereafter, Ronald, Jobs and Wozniak kept holding repeated meetings to discuss about their new business. In one such meeting at Ronald's home on one fine evening, all three of them brainstormed over launching a personal computer business. Jobs strongly believed that personal computer is gonna be the next big thing that will power every damn business in the world. Remember, this was the time when personal computer was completely an alien technology and only few people knew what computer really was. As the evening wore down, three of them finally decided to start a company that would deal in personal computers. In this new company, it was mutually decided that the two Steves would be at the helm of the affair while Ronald will play a minor role. There was no confusion in anyone's mind that this new company predominantly belonged to Jobs and Wozniak. But Ronald had no problem in accepting this fact, considering that his past track in running a business was nothing short of an actual failure. So it was finally mutually agreed upon Jobs and Wozniak would hold 45% each, while Ronald would hold just 10% stake in the company. But even with 10% stake, Ronald supposedly had a huge influence in the company. Especially when Jobs and Wozniak did not agree on key decisions, it was Ronald's responsibility to cast a decisive vote and break the deadlock. After the ownership issue was settled down, their company was officially registered and Apple company was finally born on 1st of April 1976. Well, an interesting date for that matter. And it was Ronald who drafted the partnership agreement, outlining the role of each founder in the company. As per the agreement, Jobs was responsible for looking after the marketing and Wozniak would solely look after electrical engineering. And for Ronald, he was responsible for mechanical engineering and documentation procedures. Once this was settled, Jobs and Wozniak started working on the first prototype of Apple computer, while Ronald was responsible for writing the manual of Apple computer. And he was also responsible for designing Apple's very first ever logo, which showed famous scientist Isaac Newton sitting down under the tree. In the later years, this logo was replaced by a multicolored two-dimensional Apple design, which, as we all know, became an iconic logo. So now everything was put in place and it looked almost certain for an exciting journey. The paperwork was complete, the prototype was ready, and the company even managed to secure a $15,000 funding to buy hardware material. With the help of this funding, Jobs and Wozniak's own investment, Apple manufactured 200 computers and managed to sell all of them in the first 10 months itself. Jobs even signed a lucrative contract with a local computer shop, Byte Computers, for selling 50 computers at a price tag of $500 each. Well, things were looking very upbeat and promising for Apple, and by all means, it seemed that a glorious future awaited Apple. But then came a very unexpected twist in the story. Months after signing contract with Byte Computers, Ronald resigned from Apple and sold back his entire 10% stake to two Steves for nearly $800.
You made him a 10% owner initially, and you were 45, Steve was 45, and 12 days later, Ron comes back, and he sells off his 10% saying, I want to sell it back to you for $800. That 10% today would be worth $22 billion if he was still there.
Today, Apple is the most valued company in the world, and therefore it won't be wrong to conclude that perhaps Ronald made the biggest mistake of his life when he decided to sell his entire stake in Apple. But what was Ronald Wayne really thinking when he decided to fortify his entire stake? Well, clearly Ronald's past failure haunted him and eventually got better of him. These disturbing memories of the debacle of his first company certainly proved to be too strong to overcome. He was equally mindful of the contentious clause in the partnership agreement that clearly stated that all parties would be responsible for any debt incurred by individual members. He was also spooked by the fact that Byte Computers, the computer shop that Jobs signed a lucrative contract with, had a notorious reputation of defaulting on payments. Besides, the age was not in his favor. Ronald was 41 years old at that time, and he clearly could not match up with the energy and spirit of Jobs and Wozniak, who at that time were just 21 and 25 years. Well, last but not the least, today, Apple may be the most successful company in the world. But back in the 70s, Apple was one of the many small startups that usually operated from small garages and homes. And just like today, even back then, most startups and small companies enjoyed a very poor success rate, with nearly 90% of startups shutting their shops within 2 or 3 years. And Ronald obviously thought that Apple too will meet the same fate, and that's why he made an exit. But looking at things in hindsight, it is clear that Ronald made a big error of judgment. Many people believe that Ronald's decision to sell stake in Apple in 1976 will go down as the biggest missed opportunity in the corporate history. This brings us to a very fundamental question. How much money did Ronald Wayne miss out on, and how much his 10% stake would be worth today? If one simply goes by Apple's current market cap of $3 trillion, then his 10% stake should be somewhere around $300 billion. And even if we were to assume that Ronald must have diluted a large part of his 10% stake and currently own only 1 or 2%, even then he would be a billionaire. So today, does Ronald really regret and even feel depressed about missing on the billion-dollar exit from Apple? Well, here's what Ronald thinks.
Did you have any doubt that Apple would be a successful company?
None. It was the right product at the right time.
So why did you sell out?
My passion wasn't computers in the first place, it was slot machines. I also knew that I was standing in the shadow of giants. And as a result, I knew I was never going to have a product of my own to develop.
You must often think of what could have been with Apple. I mean, do you?
I knew exactly what would have been if I'd have stayed with the company. I would have wound up heading a very large documentation department at the back of the building, shuffling papers for the next 20 years of my life, and that was not the future that I saw for myself.
Many people may be wondering, how did Ronald Wayne's life really unfold after he left Apple? Well, did he ever thought of making a comeback at Apple? After leaving Apple, Ronald did many jobs across small and medium-sized companies and led a pretty financially secure life. After spending many years doing small jobs, he opened a small store dealing in coins and stamps. For the time being, his stamp store business achieved a pretty decent success. But following the crash of the stamp market, he was forced to close the store. After closing down the stamp business, Ronald's life faced a severe setback when his house was robbed and his entire savings, including expensive gold and silver ornaments, vanished in broad daylight. Well, unfortunately for Ronald, he was never able to fully recover from this financial loss and had to sell some of his real estate properties to make up for this loss. Today, Ronald is living in a small mobile home park in Nevada, where he is currently busy pursuing his passion for collecting stamps and coins. Even to imagine that one of Apple's co-founders living in a small mobile home is hard to believe. But this is where Ronald is currently living. Even when Apple started reaching dazzling height of success, the thought of rejoining Apple never once crossed his mind. And this despite the fact that he continued to remain in touch with Jobs and Wozniak for several decades. By the way, some people might be curious to know, what did Jobs and Wozniak really thought of Ronald several decades after he left the company? Well, if one goes by the media statements and interview, then it is a pretty obvious thing that both had huge respect for Ronald. They especially praised the way he conducted himself throughout his life, living a life of dignity and high principles.
Knowing how these things work, and he attracted Steve Jobs. So Steve said, well, we can hire him, and he'll do a manual for us. He's good at doing manuals. He sat down to a typewriter and typed out our partnership agreement, all the legal phrases and words, and I mean, I don't know how a person knows how to do that. He was incredibly talented. He drew the sketch, an etching by hand of Newton under the apple tree for the cover of our first Apple I manual, so that if Steve and I disagreed about something, Ron could resolve it. And I met Ron and was, wow, so impressed. He knew all these different things. And
talking about Ronald's principles, he never really tried hard to hog any media limelight, even though he was co-founder of a company like Apple. And nor did he try to pull off any cheap PR stunt by exaggerating about his friendship with Jobs or Wozniak. Well, Ronald was too much of a simpleton to pull off such theatrics. However, he did write a book on Apple named Adventures of an Apple Founder. This book was published in early 2010. The book recounted Ronald's brief stint in Apple and his experience of working with Jobs and Wozniak. Ronald Wayne, the man who could have been a billionaire by now, and somebody who will probably be remembered as the most unlucky man, at least from Apple's consideration. But let's be fair, not everybody has to be ambitious in life. Some people simply want to live a simple life without much drama or fuss, and as cliche as it may sound. But the fact is that money and fame does not buy happiness in life. And who knows, today Ronald Wayne may be more happy and more peaceful with himself than most people can ever imagine. Well, that was it for this story. If you liked this episode, make sure to hit the subscribe button and tell us in comments what more topics you want us to cover. This was Prashant signing off. See you in the next one.